This is The Time Tower, a 2D platformer with an emphasis on speed. It was made in 3 days for the Ludum Dare 51 Game Jam, and the theme of the jam was every 10 seconds. Here's the story of how it was made. I decided to make the game a 2D platformer, 1 because platformers are my favorite genre, 2 because 2D is supposed to be easier than 3D, and 3 because I already had an idea for the game. In fact, it's an idea I had back when I first started learning Godot, and wanted to do something that would be simple, but would still test my competency in the new game engine. In Mario Party DS, there is a minigame called All Geared Up, where you try to get to the top of a clock as fast as you can. That's my idea. Not to a T, but I wanted to capture that essence. So I made a temporary character sprite and started working on a 2D movement script. Throughout the last few years, almost all of my movement scripts have been based on a single script that I designed for one of my earliest 3D games several years ago. This was constantly referenced, copied, modified, with minimal changes to the core structure. Rarely ever did I actually start from zero and code the movement myself, test the movement myself, and add features not based on code that I read or learned about online, but instead based on what I felt the game needed and how I thought it should be implemented. And truth be told, I've never been super thrilled with my movement systems. But when you're making a fast-paced 2D platformer, you want the movement to be thrilling, or at the very least, good. So I started from zero, added basic controls, and started molding it from there. I made gravity stronger while the player was falling down than when they were going up, to create a good sense of weight. I created a jump cue, so that if you press the button slightly before the character hits the ground, it will remember the input on contact. I also added in a coyote timer, which allows the player an extra fraction of a second to press jump, even if they've already left the platform. Just the kind of stuff that makes the game feel more fair and responsive. I threw together a rough level for testing the movement, and was surprised to find that the movement actually felt good. On previous projects, I would spend hours running around till I'd gotten completely used to the movement and could no longer tell if it was fun or not. But by preventing myself from spending too long with the controls, and making it a rule to stop playing and start fixing the moment something bothered me, I found that instead of changing how I play to work with the controls, I was changing the controls to work with how I play. And with minimal testing time, I was getting better, snappier, and more satisfying movement than in any of my previous games. Some decent feeling movement right there, and I engineered that all myself, which makes me awesome. Throughout development, I continued to iterate upon the movement script. It steadily grew more and more advanced, with a lot of different actions depending on a combination of in-game factors and player inputs. I added wall jumps, which meant that I wanted wall slides, which meant that I had to consider if the character was jumping, attempting to jump, falling, pushing to the side, which side were they pushing to, was the moon waxing or waning, and I had to carefully craft a set of ifs and actions for every combination of these factors. It was definitely a test of my ability to organize and follow code, but you know what? It was really fun, and I'm super happy, not only with the result of the script, but with its structure too. As per usual, it's far from perfect, but it's in a much more readable and modifiable state than most of my other stuff. That's a win for gradual improvement. At this point, I decided to create the systems required for the actual game loop. I wanted to get all the core features implemented so that I would have the following days free for just working on art, levels, and other bonus features, instead of rushing to cram all that stuff in before the deadline, like I usually do. But first, what is the gameplay loop? Every 10 seconds. I thought about how I could make this game fit that theme, and ended up liking the idea of only having 10 seconds to beat each level. This meant that the levels would have to be very short, but that also meant getting the project done a lot quicker. The system is pretty simple. I have a timer that constantly ticks down and gets reset every time it either hits 0 or the player makes it to the next checkpoint. And in the case of the former, it also sends a signal to the game master to kill the player and set their position to whatever the last checkpoint was. With all the main systems a go, it was time to start building upon the foundation. Art, obstacles, animations, that kind of thing. Let's start by quickly making a tile map, I thought foolishly. Here I present the idea, and here I present the reality. I wanted the tiles to resemble that lovely trim around the edges and those shiny bronze central areas. However, I settled for passable brown once I realized how painful it is to create a full tile set that works for every possible tile combination. Constant copy, paste, readjust, reshape, compare. All of this took well over an hour. By the time the tile set was working functionally, my patience had dwindled to the point where I no longer cared if it looked good aesthetically. I don't think it's horrible, but it is nothing like that clock. Somehow, making all of the sprites for the main character was both easier and took less time than the tile set, and even that felt way too difficult and time consuming. So dear sprite artists, my respect for you is immense. That was the first day. All I had to do for the second day was build upon the foundation I'd created. The first obstacle I created was a gear, because clocks have gears, and my approach for creating the sprite was interesting. I made a fully modeled, textured lit 3D object in Blender that was then rendered onto a low-resolution image that then got warped through every Asperite and Photoshop filter on Earth to create this image that kind of looks like sprite art. And I like how it looks, but it doesn't match the rest of the art style in the slightest. It got closer over time as I made adjustments to each sprite to try and unify them, but even that approach was sort of hampered by my refusal to spend any more time on the level tile set. Next, I made what I like to call step-outs. They're basically these platforms that appear and disappear on a set timer, and they're based on these guys. I don't know what they're actually called. Finally, I added weights. They slowly lift up, then fall down, with the goal being to crush you. The way I detect if the player's been crushed is by sending out a tiny raycast from the center of the sprite upwards and checking if it hits anything, besides the player of course. If so, it means that the player is stuck somewhere and should die. It's a little finicky, and sometimes just doesn't work, but it works most of the time, and I'm okay with that. It was now 5 PM, and I had till 3 PM the next day to finish. But at this point, I was feeling really good about how the project was progressing. The game was working, the player was moving, the graphics were passable. I added in some sounds from Freesound and SFXR, and then all I really had to do was design levels. I decided to make 10. 10 levels to be completed within 10 seconds. Completed by the player, that is. So I spent the rest of the night and the following morning just designing levels and watching Germa. My level design technique started off strong. I put the player in a simple room with 2 toggling platforms and some basic instructions for people who've never played a game before. In the second room, I introduced wall jumping since it's an important mechanic for later levels. And in the third room, I introduced holding down space to jump higher. I follow this up with a room that introduces gears in a not completely harmless but easily navigable way, which is followed up by the dumbest level I have ever designed, which is followed up by more gears and crushers and so on and so forth. I actually quite like some of these levels. In particular, there's a level where you make your way between gears and wall jump to ascend to the one above. I think it's a clever idea and that the execution is pretty fun. That's actually the only level I'm really a fan of. This project has definitely reminded me that I need to get better at level creation. Maybe I should pop open Mario Maker 2 for the first time in a year. After a few playthroughs and a bit of polishing, I was feeling just about ready to release the game, so I gave it to a couple friends to playtest.
You made an impossible game!
I'm, like, actually struggling with this.
I think this little game you made is absolutely f***ed. I hate you.
Why is it so hard?
F*** you. F*** you.
I hate this game and I hate you now.
F*** you.
I hope you lose the game jam.
My first full run of the game took 4 minutes. One friend took 24 minutes, and the other took an hour and 10 minutes. I'm being completely honest when I say that I in no way intended for this to be a rage game, but that's kind of the impression I got from them. Rage. The guy that took over an hour was Derek. Now, in his defense, that first build of the game did have some issues with platform timing. The animation of the clock weight falling took 3 seconds, whereas the animation of the platform appearing and disappearing took 4 seconds. But since I wanted them to be in sync, I had to change the speed of the animations to line them up. And instead of being smart and setting the 3-second animation to play at 75% speed, I set the 4-second animation to play at 133.33333 to infinity% speed, which was rounded. And by the time Derek had made it to the final level, the mechanism had fallen out of sync, making it nearly impossible to complete, let alone practice. So, if we play it fair and only count the time it took him to get to that level, then it's only 35 minutes. Very reasonable. I went ahead and fixed the synchronization issues in the last level before I uploaded the final build. Despite the game clearly being much harder than I anticipated, I was tired and didn't feel like redesigning the levels. And there it was, the final game up, out, and ready for judgment. And a few hours before the deadline at that. No stress today, just regular old exhaustion. I've since had plenty of time to reflect upon the work I've done and the game I made and the feedback I've received, and this is some of what I found. The visuals are fine. I find that my style varies quite a bit between games, so I'm not super bothered if one game looks better than another, since I'm always trying different things. It's not the prettiest pixel art out there, but it's simple and functional. If there's anything I'm really not a fan of though, it's that background image. I got it off Pixabay and tried adjusting it to fit with the rest of the game, but it doesn't, and I really dislike it. If I was to make this project again, I honestly might have tried to find a tile set online and work with it from there. While the people in the jam really seemed to enjoy the way the game controlled, both friends that played said that they didn't like them. One explained that it's too floaty and the lack of distinction between the low jump and the high jump made predicting jumps difficult. The other said that they were just bad at platforming games. But while the movement isn't perfect, I'm much happier with the flexibility of the system I made compared to my previous projects. From the perspective of someone who likes running through level 1-1 of any Mario game as fast as possible, I enjoyed, quote-unquote, speedrunning my own game. But as someone who doesn't share the perspective of a more serious speedrunner, such as one who focuses on mastering certain strategies, exposing exploits, analyzing the build of the game, that kind of thing, I can't be too sure how well this even fits the bill of a good speedrunning game. For one, it's very short, which makes the repetition quick and easy, and the barrier to entry very low. But that also makes the possibility for error much slimmer, such that the hypothetical perfect run may be achievable by a large number of people very early on, which would ruin any chance at future records or competition. It's also a game with, I think, very limited movement options that prevent the use of weird exploits. Think backwards long jumps or look down in GoldenEye. And this also limits player creativity. And crucially, this is a game with many of its elements on a timer. Things rotate, oscillate, and flicker at a specific rhythm, which may make it difficult or even impossible to progress before a certain event. It's a game with more or less a right way to beat it, and minimal ways to vary, I think. Which could mean that all in all, the game isn't very appealing from a speedrunning perspective. Nevertheless, I think it's a fun challenge for those who have managed to beat the game normally. So instead of thinking of it as a game meant to be speedrun with and against others, maybe think of it as a game where you compete against your previous self, and maybe some friends. A game that can be mastered if you put in the effort. And how about this? My personal record at this time is 1:16:91. I want to see how many people can beat that. And I want to see how many people can beat the game in general. While this game isn't one that I'm as proud of for not being as artistically fulfilling, I think it's a nice little experience that's fairly fun to play. And the link to play is below. Ciao for now.